Hello all. My name is Kevin Swain and I'm the Speakers Director for the Buckley program. I'll be introducing the moderator for our second panel today, which is titled Conservatism and Libertarianism, a Union of Fire and Ice. That title comes from a 1981 essay by Russell Kirk, and we heard plenty commentary on that subject in the last panel, and we're looking forward to more of it in this one. So I'll start by introducing our moderator. Kathryn Jean Lopez is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, where she directs the Center for Religion, Culture, and Civil Society, and is an editor-at-large of National Review magazine. She's also a nationally syndicated columnist with Andrews McMeel Universal. Lopez has been published by a wide variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Stars and Stripes, the National Catholic Register, and First Things. She's also a columnist for Our Sunday Visitors News Weekly, and is co-author of the book, How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice. Lopez speaks frequently on faith in public life, including on college campuses as well as on radio and television, including on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, PBS, and Vatican Radio. A product of New York City Catholic education, she serves on a number of Catholic boards and is a member of Cardinal Timothy Dolan's Pro-Life Commission. She is also a spiritual director, certified by the Cenacle of Our Lady of Divine Providence in Clearwater and the Franciscan University of Steubenville. Please give a warm welcome to our moderator, Kathryn Jean Lopez.
So now that you've had an obscenely long bio for me, I'm going to give very quick bios for our panelists, because I know that most of you probably know them, and if you don't, you can read their bios in the program. Charlie Cooke, first of all, is a colleague of mine at National Review. He's the editor of National Review Online, co-host of a podcast, Mad Dogs and Englishmen, and an author of the of the conservative, I'm going to bitch it, Conservatarian manifesto. Megan McArdle is a columnist at the Washington Post and author of the very humble book, The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is Key to Success, a book that I love. And Rusty Reno is the editor of First Things magazine and author, among other things, of the book Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society. And so we are talking today about is conservatism and libertarianism a union of fire and ice? And you know, one of the hard things about being on a panel or speaking to a group is it's not until the question and answer or after the panel that we actually know who's in the room. And so not knowing who is in the room, you know, it's a mix of, my sense is, Russell Kirk scholars or conservative scholars and activists and students who are wondering who Russell Kirk is. So, apparently I'm right, okay. So let me explain the title of the panel. Some of you know, some of you may not know. The idea of a union in fire and ice comes from a 1981 Russell Kirk essay where he writes, among other things, I'm not going to read the whole thing, you can find it online, but very provocatively, and will probably help incite some debates about whether he was a fusionist or not. He wrote, "What else do conservatives and libertarians possess in common? The answer to that question is simple: nothing, nor will they ever have. To talk about forming a league or coalition between these two is like advocating a union of fire and ice. The ruinous falling of the ideologues who call themselves libertarians is their fanatic attachment to a simple, solitary principle, that is, to the notion of personal freedom as the whole end of the civil social order, and indeed of human existence. The libertarians are old-fangled folk in the sense that they live by certain abstractions of the 19th century." Yes, he had no opinion, apparently. Then he goes on to say they carry to absurdity the doctrines of John Stuart Mill, and he also goes on and says, since Mill, the libertarians have forgotten nothing and learned nothing. Now, I certainly hope, because we have a libertarian and a half-libertarian on our panel, I think you can say, based on reading their writing, they've learned a lot since Mill, and they have a lot to offer since Mill. He goes on to write, I'll just read from the end. When heaven and earth have passed away, perhaps the conservative mind and the libertarian mind may be joined in synthesis, but not until then. So, based on the political landscape, that broken landscape that George Nash mentioned in the previous panel, I certainly hope we can get somewhere practical and productive here during this panel. So I just want to start, maybe Charlie, if you don't mind starting. So is this a union of fire and ice, or is it something that simply must be, which I think is part of the premise of your book?
I'm in a hugely advantageous position here because I am the squish in the middle, so I can play both sides against each other. I don't think it's a futile project. No, I think it's a necessary project for a number of reasons. The book I wrote was called The Conservatarian Manifesto. Obviously, that is a combination of the two words, not a particularly pretty word, but it's better than liberservative, which was the alternative. But I think both are necessary if we're to have a healthy right in this country. And I think that it's possible to see the flaws in both sides. I think the flaw in libertarianism, when it's taken too far, is that it can seem algebraic. There is a tendency among some libertarians to sketch out what the right answer is on a piece of paper and not apply it to the real world, and in so doing undermine some of the social structures and traditions on which liberty and the sort of liberty libertarians want rely. And the flaw with conservatism, if it's taken too far, is to assume that Chesterton's fence can never be touched and should never be touched. Tradition is, of course, extremely important. I won't rehearse all the arguments in its favor, but you can start to sound as if you're proposing that something is a certain way and therefore should be a certain way. And to understand both of these flaws, I think, is a positive thing. I don't think one has to pretend that any instinct or avenue is perfect. I also think that both libertarianism and conservatism grasp something that, broadly speaking, their adversaries on the left do not, and that is human nature. I think that the biggest flaw within the progressive worldview is the assumption that one can perfect man, that new Soviet man is just around the corner, that we are different in some way. You know, Woodrow Wilson, in one of his many criticisms of the Constitution, said, look, this was written when we didn't even have telephones. Well, yes, it was, but it wasn't a guide to the building of a communications infrastructure. It was a guide to the management of human nature. And human nature, I think, did not appear differently in the politics of the Romans. It did not appear differently in the politics of the British. And it would not appear differently in the colonies either. The founders understood that. I think conservatives and libertarians both understand that in different ways and to different extents. But as the American left has become more and more utopian, I think that the capacity of both conservatives and libertarians to provide a counterbalance in that crucial realm is an important one. I will now leave it to the other two to fight it out, and then I'll pretend I'm correct in the moderate position. But as a starting point, I would disagree humbly with Russell Kirk on that, especially at this moment in our history.
The only thing in the middle of the road, Charles, is yellow lines and dead armadillos.
Megan is in fire and ice. You don't get to just make a joke.
No, actually, I'm going to agree with Charles more than that suggested. I just wanted to say it because it's funny. And because as the kind of resident squish at the Washington Post, I get a lot of that from both sides. So I am, as libertarians go, a fairly squishy one. I get expelled from the movement regularly. Reportedly, my husband's old boss at a libertarian publication used to start meetings by saying, "Suderman, would you like to explain this garbage your wife has been writing?" But so I think that there is an inherent tension between libertarianism and conservatism. They have fundamentally different kind of first principles, right? And I think that, like Charles, I think that both of those first principles have strengths and weaknesses, right? Like, you know, if you spend a lot of time in the libertarian movement, you will find yourself at 3 a.m. some morning trying to convince an anarcho-capitalist that the insurance companies should not just be allowed to send their random squads of goons to search your house if they think you've stolen something from one of their clients. But conservatism has its moments too. You know, I remember sitting in a seminar with a bunch of conservatives and libertarians, and one of the conservatives looked up and said, "Can anyone dispute that life was, for the average person, was better in the 19th century?" And the women and people of color in the room looked up and said, yes, actually I could. And I actually think that that is, you know, one of the fractures that we have now is that conservatism is always inherently kind of a philosophy of place and a particular people. There is no such thing as a conservative universalism. That would be a non sequitur, right? Whereas liberalism and libertarianism are both in different ways. They're universalist prescriptions. And so conservatism has the issue right now that the America it's trying to conserve is changing in a lot of ways. And that is going to fracture some of the things that have held libertarians and conservatives together, because when conservatives were trying to conserve basically what the libertarians wanted, that was easy. And you know, there's also the fact that we were held together by the Cold War in a way that I think a lot of us didn't really appreciate, or those of us who considered ourselves fusionist libertarians didn't really appreciate the extent to which the entire Republican and conservative coalition had been held together by the fact that we could all agree, no matter what else divided us, we hate the godless communists. Well, you know, 40 years on, we're sort of having our Wile E. Coyote moment where we look down and suddenly realize there's nothing underneath us, right? 2016 knocked out the supports that we were still running forward, just as if we were in the old coalition. And then Trump comes along and says, no, actually look down. There's nothing there. And that is going to produce some interesting fallout. So can this marriage be saved? I think that there are important ways in which conservatives and libertarians are really going to face a strong impetus to divide in the next 20 years or so, in the next 5 years, in the next 1 year. In part because I doubt, you know, a lot of people in this room who are Kirk people are probably not Trump people. But the fact is, as Ross Douthat recently wrote, you have to recognize that at least movement conservatism, he has changed it. It's not like if he leaves in 2020, we're just going to go back and pretend that didn't happen. And it has revealed some things about who the conservative base, as opposed to the conservative wonkatariat, were, and what they actually wanted, as opposed to what we thought they wanted. Those were very different things. But he's also changing, when you force people into alliances, we are social animals. We like to think that we derive everything from first principles, especially if we are libertarians. I love sitting around with libertarians trying to derive whether, you know, who pays the dinner check from first principles, starting with Aristotle and working forward. We don't, though. I mean, our ideas cluster in ways that are not logical, right? If I know your views on abortion, I can predict almost certainly your views on global warming. What do those two things have to do with each other? Almost nothing, right? We choose our views. They come as a package. We can only be expert on 2 or 3 things. We tend to look at our friends and maybe they're expert on something else. If we like them, so we adopt their views, which is why these views cluster irrationally from a first principles perspective, but rationally from a social perspective. Well, as the movement changes, that is going to change how people think about it. Not like the 5 people who are sitting down and rationally working it all out from books and philosophy, but for most of the movement, that is going to change. And so that's going to be a huge stressor, and you're already seeing this. You know, the Never Trump people are being driven out of the Republican Party, and to some extent, some of them look like they're being driven out of conservatism. Precisely because they refuse to answer that litmus test with a yes. Are your loyalties with us or against us? If I have to choose, against. If Trump is what I have to choose for. So that's a big stressor, but the bigger stressor was just that the defense hawks, the evangelicals, And the free marketers didn't all necessarily belong in the same coalition, not all of them anyway, without communism to oppose. And for a long time, and you still see this, just being held together by like their hatred of liberals. And, you know, liberal overreach is really helping. Bake me a cake liberalism has really hurt, you know, the libertarians who for years with me were, you know, saying, obviously gay marriage, great. I think if you had told me in 2010, well, obviously if we have gay marriage, then Christian bakers will be legally required to bake cakes for gay weddings or else go out of business. I would have been like, that is some conservative nonsense. That is just a talking point, right? So that is helping hold the coalition together. But you can't always count on liberals to be out there like helping push conservatives back into the, libertarians back into the fold. Well, you know, in the 90s, they did kind of get it together for a few years. I do think that there is one thing, though, that you can say holds them together more deeply, which is to go back to what I said at the beginning, which is that conservatism is always inherently a philosophy of a place and a culture and a people. The particular strand of American conservatism, someone once said to me that like libertarianism is just a form of American nationalism. And when you go abroad, you actually kind of understand what they're talking about, which is that foreign libertarians don't think like American libertarians. American libertarians have a lot more kind of patriotic packaging around it. That's changing to some extent, but that has long been something that the foreign libertarians definitely didn't feel. But they're more like interested in lowering business regulation and less interested in a kind of broader package of first principle ideas. There are exceptions to this, so I'm making very, very sweeping generalization. But by the same token, right, what is American conservatism conserving as opposed to French conservatism or British conservatism? It is fundamentally conserving a lot of stuff that libertarians agree with, right? It is conserving a 1789 idea about what constitutes a well-ordered society, and that's an idea that libertarians are in many ways, not always, but in many ways extremely comfortable with. And so that is going to help push us back together because conservatives may be doing it for a different reason, but they're trying to do the same thing in a lot of ways. The question is whether principle or what Trump represents, which is not a principled argument at all, it's more of a folk argument, right? It is an argument, and I mean that in the German as well as the American sense of the word. It is an argument about, you know, this is us, we good, this is them, they bad. And that can be a very powerful argument, but it is not really an argument about philosophy or first principles. And so the question is, if that is what ends up driving all of the social dynamics in the two movements, can these two things hang together? The answer is, I don't know. I would certainly like to find a way to salvage it. I still think of myself as being on the right, a right libertarian rather than a left libertarian. And I see a lot of good things in conservatism. But Trump and the broader problems of what we do when we don't have the same things to be against, and when conservatives are for some things that libertarians are really strongly against, how do we hold that together? I'm not sure.
All right. Yeah, fire and ice. I'm definitely the kind of Kirk Ian here. I think I want to make 3 points. One is about kind of conceptually about the two ways of thinking, and the second one is about the American context, and Megan made a good point there. And then finally about the present political challenges that we face. It seems to me obvious that conservatism and libertarianism are antithetical. Conservatism is a set of dispositions, it's a habit of mind. Libertarianism is a modern political-moral theory, and it's a kind of utopianism that is a kind of, it's the mirror image of Marxism in the sense that it's a dream of anarchy, that there is no overriding organizing principle and that we can fish in the morning and read poetry in the afternoon in the ideal society. Conservatism, second antithesis, conservatism emphasizes devotion, loyalty, and piety, and libertarianism has this singular focus on freedom. Third, I think, antithesis, conservatism anguishes over what is not preserved. I think libertarians anguish over what is being prevented. Fourth antithesis, conservatism sees moral order and authority as the foundation of a free society and is willing to use political means to ensure that that moral order and authority is sustained. Whereas libertarianism tends to see moral order and authority as a threat to a free society, especially when political means are used to sustain it. Another antithesis, conservatism sees the individual most fully realized in shared loves, whereas libertarianism tends to seek unencumbered individuals. So we're most fully realized when we're liberated, whereas for a conservative, we're most fully realized when we're bound together in shared loves. And then finally, the antithesis, which I think is important politically, and that is that conservatism as a sentiment is a mass phenomenon, whereas libertarianism is an exclusively elite way of thinking. And I think this has an effect. I think libertarianism was very influential in the conservative movement, but I think the last electoral cycle showed, at least in the primaries, that it really moves almost no voters, whereas a certain kind of mass conservative sentiment can, in fact, move large populations of voters. So that's my observation antithesis. But there's a complexifying factor in the American context, which is, and I think American conservatives will always have a soft spot for libertarianism. I mean, live free or die, says the, don't tread on me. These are the great slogans of the revolution. So our tradition is one of liberty, and so our piety is liberal in the classical sense. And insofar as libertarianism is a kind of formalization and intensification of the classical liberal tradition, I think American conservatives will always have a soft spot for libertarianism, even though it is as I described, in many ways antithetical. Final point, and this is, I suppose, my most programmatic point about going forward from today. I think libertarianism is worse than irrelevant for facing the challenges in 2018. We do not suffer from collectivism, tyranny, or overbearing authority. Instead, we suffer from disunity, fragmentation, borderlessness, limited openness, and we have a hyper-competitive marketplace that, in fact, seems to lead the young people that I know to lives of intense conformity and fear, which is actually the antithesis of freedom. So, in my view, not only does libertarianism have no resources to address these problems, it is actively hostile to even formulating or identifying these problems because it's hostile to all consolidating community-forming loves as essentially threatening to freedom. I guess if I would want to put it succinctly, libertarianism is hostile to the we. And our crisis politically today is a crisis of the we, which has become elusive for us. And it strikes me that Trumpianism, its success at the, politically, which was so unexpected, stems from a desire of a large segment of the population for some restoration of a unifying sense of the we. And I think it's going to be very difficult to recover that unifying sense, but I don't think libertarianism has anything to offer as we try to recover it, because it doesn't have a way to describe, it has no place in its theory for the we.
Charlie, I saw you writing things down, so maybe let you have a first go at that.
One of the things that I hear all the time when I'm talking about my book, especially from college students, is they say, well, when I'm around libertarians, I feel conservative, and when I'm around conservatives, I feel libertarian. And I just got that feeling sequentially in the last 10 minutes. So when Megan was speaking, I said, damn you, you're a crazy libertarian. And then Rusty comes in, and I said, wow, I'm suddenly Murray Rothbard all over again. So if I just sort of respond to both of those, I think, Rusty, I don't recognize entirely the portrait of libertarianism that you just painted. I don't think libertarians are anarchists. I don't think they're completely disinterested in community or coherence. In fact, one of the things you notice if you hang around with libertarians is they really like rules. They don't think there should be too many of them, but they do like rules. They want well-established structures. They like the Constitution because it gives both a framework for their conception of limited government, and also it gives a means by which to push back against that government, which is its primary purpose, at least from the libertarian perspective. And a lot of libertarians will tell you, look, I'm actually not a libertine, but I think that political violence should be limited to only limited circumstances. And so I want to use the state sparingly, but also I am, for example, a Muslim, a Christian, an observant Jew. And I enjoy that part of my life, and it's extremely important to me, and I impose my own limitations on myself, and I am willing to submit to other authorities, or I want to join groups in my community. But, don't tread on me. I don't want the federal government to do very much. So just to speak up for the sort of libertarian side there, I think we ought to be careful not to conflate a view of government and of force with a view of the world. In terms of the conservative side, I slightly disagree with you, Megan, that there's no such thing as conservative universalism in America, because and this may be semantic. It may be a semantic problem we have, but it does matter that the country was founded in revolution, and then we had a classically liberal constitution, which people on the right want to conserve. I mean, what does that make you? I've often struggled with this. If you wish to conserve a revolution, are you a conservative or are you a revolutionary? You want to conserve your marriage, well, you're still married at the end of it. So are you a liberal if you want to conserve liberalism? Are you a conservative? It's difficult to tell sometimes in America, but I think that the agreement between conservatives and libertarians, at least on the constitutional question, is in and of itself somewhat universal. I don't think that is limited to place. I don't think that is limited to people. I don't think that is limited to a particular group. I mean, if you see the same ardor in the defense of the constitutional order and the founding in the words of Abraham Lincoln as you do in the words of Frederick Douglass. They were not clearly the same person or from the same background. To knit them together, I'm quite hopeful about this alliance. Firstly, because, look, we're all weirdos. We're in this room on a Friday afternoon. We debate these things. I'm glad we do. I'm happy to own my own weirdo-ness. But most people don't behave like this, right? I mean, like most people about now, they're like, right, you want to go to Buffalo Wild Wings and watch the game. So, they're not as interested in purity as we are. Megan, I don't know Rusty so well, but Megan and I both, sort of know people who almost come to blows over these questions. Most people don't. Most people are happy to side with others who maybe fit 65, 70% of the bill. Now, there are serious differences between libertarians and conservatives, not just philosophically, not just in terms of starting principles, those things are real, but also in terms of the way that their philosophies and their worldviews are applied within practical politics. Now, one of them obviously is immigration, and I think that's going to grow. At least if the Republican Party continues on its current path, there's going to be more tension between Republicans, conservatives, libertarians, everyone on the right, frankly. Foreign policy, we've got a little bit of a lull at the moment, actually, because although I don't think he has a coherent foreign policy, the president has enough about him to please people on both sides. We're not at war. If we go back to where we were in the 2000s, you will see more of a fight between libertarians and conservatives. But a lot of the arguments I think we see at the moment are really more to do with focus and emphasis than they are to do with wildly different worldviews. And one of the reasons for that, as Megan said, is because the left is gone nuts. I don't think the left is going to get less nuts in the next few years. That's, you know, I hope it does get less nuts, but I don't think it's going to. And so the question is going to be, is it the case that conservatives and libertarians are actually in tension on most questions, or is it the case that they're focusing on different things but broadly agree? I mean, I'll give you an example and then I'll sort of hand it back. When I go to Reason magazine, where Megan's husband works, when I go to Cato Institute, I have conversations with people, and I agree with them entirely until they get to the how important is this thing we are talking about bit. So, for example, I think the status quo with the drug war is a disaster. I'm not in favor of drugs. I don't like drugs. I don't want to take drugs. They destroy people's lives. But I think there is a coherent and convincing argument that it would be better if we ended the drug war and all of the bad things that would happen, and they would, all of the bad things that would happen are allowed to happen because that would be better than the status quo. I think it's a coherent argument. And that's the sort of argument you will hear at Cato and at Reason. And I'm totally open to it until the person making it says, and this is the defining issue of our time, right? Now, but we agree. We agree. And I think there's an awful lot more comity than we sometimes acknowledge, because Cato will choose to focus on that and to write about that and to promote that in a way, say, National Review wouldn't. But it's not the same thing as having a substantial and across-the-board aversion to the other side's way of seeing the world, way of seeing the Constitution, way of looking at the future. So I'm pretty hopeful, at least in the immediate future, the next 20, 30 years. I think we're stuck together, and I think it's a good thing.
Could I...
Well, Megan, did you want to jump in first? And then
Sure. You know, I want to say that in some ways I agree with Rusty, which is that I think libertarianism has some real challenges, which is, again, why I keep getting kicked out of the movement. I think that there are real questions now about, for example, have we been free riding on cultural capital in a way that we didn't understand? Does liberalism require a certain amount of other cultural capital that kind of unbridled liberalism will destroy and then implode upon itself? This is in part the Patrick Deneen argument. This is, I think, a real question that libertarians need to grapple with, and sticking our fingers in our ears and saying, la, 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 I can't hear you, is not going to cut it. You know, I also think that there are real questions about kind of intermediating institutions, right? In the kind of institutions that churches used to provide before we all decided we would rather watch Netflix on Sundays. Maybe not everyone in this room, but like, as a nation, we seem to be heading where Europe went 30, 40 years ago. Those, you know, libertarians didn't like those institutions. The 50s didn't like those institutions. Every other movie in the 1950s is about how horrible this oppressive, like, conventional life is, and we need to get rid of all of it, and we got rid of all of it, and it turns out it's not that great. But we have new intermediating institutions, and I've been thinking a lot of this, about this with things like Twitter, and with things like the evolution of the Twitter mob, which doesn't just like scream at people. You know, I'm used to being screamed at, right? Like, so fun story. My mother, when my grandmother was dying, one of my cousins went like crazy and started sending my mother all of these crazy emails, like 6, 8 emails a day, saying like screaming at her. And then the emails started saying things like, "And the world would be better off without you in it." And my mother freaked out and was like, "I should get a restraining order." And I was like, "Mom, calm down. It's okay. I get death threats all the time. It's not that big a deal." So fun fact, Mom, I get death threats all the time does not calm mothers down at all. Just to, like, for your own future reference. But it's not just screaming.
That was your idea of a fun story.
You know, like the first time someone emails you a picture of your house with a gun sight superimposed over it, you kind of freak out. And then like the 20th time, you're like, dude, that's all you got? You're not going to show up? You are like this has been happening since 2003. The people I worry about are the people who email me to tell me things like, I know you're helping the CIA spy on me, and if you don't stop, I'm going to have to take action. Those are the people I worry about because they're warning you, right? They want to give you a chance to turn it around.
Oh, just stop helping the CIA and they'll go.
I have a mortgage to pay, Charles. But so, you know, with Twitter mobs, the idea is not just that, and with things like the post-Obergefell movements and a lot of other things that have happened in basically the past sort of 5 years, is that these are these emergent, spontaneous, we love that, libertarians, it's spontaneous order, it's emerging, and what it's emerging to do is hunt people down and make it so that they can't hold any job better than janitor unless they subscribe to 80, you know, the 95 theses of modern liberalism. And that's a problem to me. It's not a government power problem, but it's an actual problem that libertarianism doesn't have a good language to talk about, right? And we need to be thinking about that. That's a huge challenge for us, is the evolution of that 50s small town that everyone was unveiling against, except it's the entire world and you can't even move to another small town and start over. But that said, I think conservatism has always had challenges too, and that one of those big challenges is a massive change in the demographics of the country. And that is going to be a challenge for conservatism because that is a cultural difference. It is like there are things that you cannot conserve when the majority of the country is not like, let's face it, the majority of people who belong to the conservative movement. Or you cannot do it without doing things that are repressive and horrible. You know, to give a very small example of this, famous Scalia case. Smith versus the Oregon Employment Commission. Does anyone know this case? Right. You cannot take, the state cannot discriminate against you, is allowed to discriminate against you if you take peyote for a religious ceremony. Right. This goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and then Scalia writes the opinion. Now, who thinks that that opinion would have been written about, say, Catholic sacramental wine during Prohibition? If anyone says yes, no. There is no way that Antonin Scalia would have said that, yes, of course, the state can prohibit you from taking the central religious ceremony of your religion if it were Catholics. And that's a problem. And the fact that conservatives do not recognize, they don't, I have these conversations, the fact that Antonin Scalia seems not to have recognized the kind of special standard he was cutting out for a minority group that he would not have applied to his own minority group, and that he would have desperately resented having a Protestant majority and I know my dad grew up Catholic in Boston. Like, they really didn't like it when the Protestant majority did things like say, no priests in hospitals to give last rites, and oh, we'll be fair, Protestants can't give last rites either, right? Is that those are serious challenges that conservatism so far is sticking its head in the sand. The demographic transition has already happened. There is zero chance of going back. The majority of babies born in this country are now non-white. And if conservatism does not figure out a way to grapple with that, it is eventually going to end up buried by demographic change. And the last thing I would say is this, is that yes, I actually agree, right? Is that libertarianism is not offering the people who are stung by anomie, they are not making a good case to those people. Yes, conservatism can move more voters, but it can move more voters to do terrible things like vote for Hitler, right? I mean, this is actually, it's not just, yes, we don't move many, but at least we don't move them towards that. And no, I don't think Trump is Hitler. I do think that what Trump is harnessing is really, really dangerous and vicious. Not all of his voters are vicious people by any means, I don't mean that, but there is a really, really dangerous strain to what he is riding the whirlwind. And so I think that we have to be cautious about just criticizing libertarians for not being able to move voters and ask, where are we moving voters? Not just can, but should. And the thing I would close by pointing out is that, well, it is true that I don't think that we want to live as atomized individuals. Conservatism makes the opposite error quite often, right? Individuals, and in the famous words of P.J. O'Rourke, or maybe not famous, but I love them, individuals are not available in a group. They're only available individually. And ultimately, if what you're saying is your philosophy maximizes the ultimate welfare of individuals, whether we define that as like being happy or utility or whatever you want to say, whether it is maximizing how close they are to God and how moral and virtuous, whatever it is, you have to maximize that at the individual level in the end. You can't say, well, we did all the things that are great for the group, and it just happens to turn out that every individual in that group is suffering. And so I think in that place, libertarianism and conservatism can come together, because ultimately, in the end, we are all concerned about the greatest good for the greatest number. We are disagreeing over how to get there. I see.
Yeah, I think Megan, it's good, because I think you give evidence in favor of my assessment. I don't buy the majority-minority nation.
It's a fact. It's not like
the majority. People are not racially pre-programmed to think and believe in any particular way. One of the members of my church in Omaha, it was a half black, half white church. He showed the Tuskegee Airmen, and afterwards he was weeping, saying, "How could we have treated them that way? How could we have discriminated against these black airmen?" He said that, black man, we. He wants to be part of a we. And there are people who are named Gutierrez or Ortiz, they want to be part of a we. I happen to see that the crisis of our time is that we have a political leadership that refuses to give people an account of who we are. It refuses to do it. You have left-wing multiculturalists who are essentially, it's a Democratic Party is a white, rich, liberal party with a minority millet system. And we have a Republican Party dominated by a kind of economistic, libertarian way of thinking that won't offer people with a sense of a we. And we have some blustering, crude real estate developer who comes onto the scene, is actually willing to talk in a very crude way about who we are. And it's not surprising to me that he met with political success. Let me put it a different way. Political correctness is not the problem we face. It's tough if you're at Yale and you're not with the program and you get hectored and attacked. The problem is the loss of trust between the few and the many. That's the crisis throughout the West. The crisis is that the many don't believe that the few are leading them, are in solidarity with them, and eat the same rations and share the same aspirations. Until we solve that problem, we're in deep trouble.
Look, I don't actually, again, I don't disagree. I have been writing columns arguing for good soft nationalism, that we need, when people say we can solve the national anthem kneeling protest problem by getting rid of the national anthem, I'm like, no, we need more meaningless symbolic patriotism. We should be playing the national anthem not just in front of sporting events, but in front of movies, and so I think that we do need to give an account of who we are. My point is the account that conservatism has given. Now, conservatives can tell themselves that this is an account that feels like we to a whole lot of people of color in this country, but the number of people of color in the conservative movement or voting Republican does not seem to indicate that they feel like the account that is being given includes them or appeals to them as part of a greater whole. So while I completely agree that both sides, but that the liberals made a huge mistake, that leftism and liberalism both made a huge mistake in the wake of World War II, which was saying that nationalism was bad, therefore we should just get rid of any kind of patriotism or the idea of just loving your country because it's your country. Global internationalism, it turns out, is not the alternative to that. The alternative to nationalism is particularism. It is going down to your smaller constituent groups. I think this was a disastrous choice. I think that things like the way history is taught in the United States, we should always be teaching the things we did wrong. But if that's all we're teaching, that is phenomenally destructive, and it's phenomenally destructive that when I say boring things like we should have the national anthem in front of sporting events, people freak out like I was just like, hey, after lunch, let's go kill some old ladies. So I absolutely agree that that's a problem. My point is that the challenge for conservatism is going to be, and the challenge for more broadly what you're advocating for, this kind of communitarian life. The big challenge is going to be articulating a community that includes the now 50% of people. The foreign-born population is now basically at its all-time peak. It's at the same level as its all-time peak. It shows no signs of stopping. You need to.
But that's a political choice.
Whether you agree with it or not, it happened. It may have been a bad idea. It's a fact. And so you are now going to have to decide, what do we do about those people? How do we articulate, of the many who are legal citizens, because birthright citizenship, whether or not Donald Trump likes it, it's very unlikely that a court is going to allow him to deny birthright citizenship to those kids. Whether or not he should, I don't think he should, but even if you think he should, the odds that he's going to get that through a constitutionally constructed court are basically zero. And so it's a fact. How is conservatism, which, as I say, is fundamentally, American conservatism is a philosophy of America and the place that we are, which is a nation of immigrants, but it's also the place and people that we are today, not the place and people that we think we ought to have been or that we should have made different policy choices to get to 50 years ago. We have the situation we have. And what is conservatism offering to people that is going to make them say, yes, that is the we I want to belong to?
Well, I mean, I think, patriotism. If you look at the Romney campaign in 2012, the we motifs traditionally in conservatism are patriotism and religion. Those are the two we motifs. And then, we also have the freedom motif in our conservative movement, and that's the me, not the we. And there was no patriotic emphasis or religious emphasis in the Romney campaign of 2012. And you get this Trump, like I say, he's a blustering character, but we're going to say Christmas again, and we're going to make America great again. And it's easy for intellectuals like us to just sort of go, oh, that's so stupid, and it's not really a sophisticated account, and we need to get a whole theory of the. But it filled a vacuum because we've socialized, our leadership is socialized so strongly into a highly individualistic view that I think that's one reason that the many don't trust the few. Is that the few are expert in allocation of utilities. So there's a kind of technocratic expertise. But the few who places like Yale produce, they can't articulate the myth. Because we do need a new myth. We need an updated myth. There's no question about that. But we're not going to get that myth with the collapse of the humanities in higher education, with historical illiteracy from elite college students that don't really know anything about American history. Part of that is a kind of conspiracy of ignorance, because as soon as somebody starts to articulate some account of who we are, there's obviously people who are going to be on the periphery of that account. And I think that this is where I think libertarianism will always refocus us on the threats to freedom. And that endless refocusing on the threats to freedom will lead us to fail to address the question of solidarity, which I think is the one that is driving the crisis of politics throughout the West.
Charlie.
I just want to push back slightly on Megan's characterization of the Scalia case and subsequent behavior, and defend conservatism here, and then explain why, other than my great love of pedantry. The Smith case was in my view, more likely the consequence of Antonin Scalia's blind spot when the question was drugs. You know, he was fairly consistent, but when it was drugs, he tended to side with the government. You saw the same thing in Gonzalez v. Raich. But the question I think that is important to ask if we're going to evaluate conservatism is what happened next. And what happened after the Smith decision was that Congress almost uniformly passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, as did a whole host of states. There's one party and one movement in America at the moment that is undermining that, and it is not conservatives or the Republican Party at the state level and at the federal level. And more importantly, in terms of the civic institutions that have underpinned the instincts that were reflected in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, conservatives, I think, have done a great job of not just maintaining their principles, but expanding them to people who aren't Christian. If you look, for example, at the Becket Fund, I read through their cases from time to time. They are entirely ecumenical. I mean, they will quite happily defend Muslims, Sikhs, anyone who is non-Christian. They make no distinction, and an awful lot of their cases, in fact, are non-Christian. I think that's not only another example of where libertarians and conservatives are on the same side, because there is a hostility toward religion that is bubbling up on the left, but I actually think it's an area in which, and I say this as a non-believer, I think it's an area in which conservatives will continue to grow their appeal, because it hasn't quite happened yet, but there is going to come a moment within the Democratic coalition at which African Americans, who are a huge portion of the Democratic Party's base, but are not especially progressive, if you look at their self-identification, are going to hear the attacks on religion and faith and those traditions, not as an attack on, Cletus in Georgia, which is how they're intended, but it's an attack on them. I think a similar thing may happen with Hispanic immigrants as well. And when that happens, there will be an opportunity for conservatives, I think, to expand their appeal. Now, where we will agree is they haven't traditionally been especially good at that, and they can be tone deaf. One of the Jonah Goldberg was just talking about this on his podcast. One of the peculiar demographic questions in the United States currently is why Indian Americans are not overwhelmingly Republican, given what they profess to believe. In England, where as you can probably tell I'm from originally, they are overwhelmingly conservative. Indian British voters vote conservative. But in America, they don't. And in fact, they were, I think, Barack Obama's biggest group outside of African Americans in 2012. And conservatives have to accept a lot of the blame for that. A lack of outreach, a reflexive hostility and disinterest have caused that. But I think the example you gave not only shows why, libertarians and conservatives are thrust together at the moment on the question of religious liberty, but also provides not a problem, but an opportunity for conservatives to adjust to a changing country.
Let me be clear. I completely agree with you that yes, he had a thing about drugs, and sort of like it was like he saw drugs and then his mind went crazy, right, and all of his principles went straight out the door. I'm a huge admirer of the man. So if this sounds like I'm being nasty to him, I was very sad when he died, and I'm a huge admirer of Scalia. But I think that my point was merely that everyone has these kinds of blind spots, right? And it's a question of, I think we very often frame things wrong. We frame questions as a question of people doing stuff deliberately to be mean to some other group. I think this is also true with how conservatives frame the left. And so what it is that things that don't cost you then don't seem that important. And that's a big issue, because I think that there are a lot of areas there where conservatives aren't enough. Law and order, crime is probably the biggest. This is really changing thanks to the prison ministries. But that has historically been an area where conservatism's just kind of didn't pay attention to the fact that, like, having your dad stuck in jail for 20 years is a big deal for a kid. And having your husband stuck in jail, it shatters your life. It changes everything. Being stuck in jail, right? And that's not to say that, like, I'm not, you know, one of those people who thinks we should just, like, tear down all the jails and let criminals roam free in the countryside. But in fact, conservatism just was not attentive enough to the costs to the people because it was largely not falling on people who are conservatives. That is what I'm talking about. And libertarians have their own blind spots. I mean, libertarians tend to, like, just not notice a bunch of stuff that isn't very libertarian. You know, like, bankruptcy law is one where, like, they're totally fine with bankruptcy law because it exists. If we were inventing it now, libertarians would all oppose it. Or libertarians who say we don't need antitrust enforcement. And as Eugene Volokh, a libertarian law professor, once pointed out, because they'll say, well, you know, cartels don't work, people cheat. And as Eugene Volokh pointed out, cartels don't work because the contracts are legally not enforceable, which is an antitrust thing, right? It's like libertarians don't notice all of the things that have kind of, and again, they tend to think that they're reasoning from first principles much more than they are. So I'm not like just saying, conservatives are dumb, libertarians are great. I'm just saying that, like, everyone has their blind spot. The particular blind spot of conservatism is this. The blind spots of libertarianism, which, believe me, I spent a lot of time thinking about, are also, they're equally large and they're there. They're just not the same blind spot.
So can Lauren or Kevin tell me, can we steal a couple minutes for one question or two? Yeah. Okay, all right. Yeah, I figured there'd be a few. Maybe I saw this gentleman first.
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to stand out like that, but I'd like one of the underlying themes I'm hearing here, and to bring that out a little more, I'd like to recast it to what Kirk reframes as that union between fire and ice. Are we really looking at a marriage, or are we looking at some other kind of union? And to bring that out, I'd like to point you all to two things. The preamble to the Constitution is we the people in order to form a more perfect union, and that being the uniting between libertarians and conservatives. And then I'd like to point you to Federalist number 10, where Madison writes about factions checking factions. And what I've heard here today in quite detail is that libertarians and conservatives view and are readily capable of understanding each other's worst impulses. And so to me, I would just ask you, in terms of framing that union, is it necessarily a marriage, or is it necessarily a union of safeguarding each other against each other's own worst principles while building upon the uniting principle that we're all working toward? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think they're dating. I don't think they're married. But I think that there's a real...
Not living together?
Affection. They're living together probably at the moment.
It's a three-way relationship.
If you go back to Frank Meyer, I mean, he was quite harsh on the libertarians because he thought that they were useless and weren't prepared to fight the Cold War. But then the example we just heard, which is correct, is, well, I wish we had the Cold War so the libertarians and conservatives could be best friends again. So it has changed, I'm not convinced by some of the predictions from, you know, the sort of pre-1960s worldview of how libertarians and conservatives would interact. But to answer your question, I don't think it's a marriage, because marriage implies permanence. And if we end up, for example, in a situation as we did in 2003, where there's a controversial war, libertarians will leave. If we end up in which, in a situation in which, and I don't think we're there now, despite the way we talk about it, in which the sole issue confronting the country is immigration, that libertarians will leave. But at the moment, there's just too much, I think, to stop them dating.
You know, I think that it was a marriage. Is it still, is the real question. And the observation I would make is that, having now been married for almost 10 years, like, marriage makes you stupid in ways that no one warns you about before you get married. like, before I got married, I could do things like put shelves up. And I knew, like, where our batteries, I knew where my batteries were. I have no idea where my batteries are. They could be, like, in a bunker in the basement, for all I know. I tell my husband, you know, and then there was the time that I accidentally ordered, like, 10-year supply of paper towels, because he kept neatly putting them away. And then I'd be like, we have no paper towels. Off to Amazon. So I think that, like, in a way, libertarians and conservatives have kind of specialized within the movement, and, like, libertarians have just been handling the business stuff, and we're like, you know, you guys just take care of that other stuff. I'm sure you're doing fine. Like, I'll just call you if I need some social conservatism. And, like, that, we're now at a point where, like, libertarians are going to have to start thinking more deeply about the stuff that I was talking about, the cultural capital stuff, because we didn't spend any time thinking about building that up. But conservatives are going to have to start thinking about, like, what do they think about markets? Where do they want to curb them? You know, I mean, markets fundamentally, they don't like any alliances that aren't consumer alliances. They don't like borders. They don't like, and, you know, where does that fit with where conservatives are now? So I think it was a marriage. I think it's falling apart, and that makes me deeply sad. And maybe it can be saved. Maybe we can go to counseling and, like, but I think that one more thing is that I think that the other thing is it's really true. Like, my husband totally serves as a check on my worst impulses. I'm like, he'll walk into my office and I'll be like, I'm about to tweet. He's like, don't tweet. Like, do not say that.
Always good advice.
No, but, like, and then sometimes I will be like, do not shout at that man in the other car while we were driving. Like, you could just, like, talk to me. Let's talk about sunshine and roses, right? Is that, like, when marriage is good, yeah, that's what one of the things that your partner does is prevent you from doing dumb things and sort of moderate your worst tendencies. And I think that conservatives and libertarians have both done that for each other. And frankly, I think as a nation, like, I would include liberals in this. Let's throw them in there. They have moderated some of our worst impulses. And, you know, I would like to see the entire country get the marriage back together. But I don't see a lot of prospect for that at the moment. Everyone seems really pretty, I mean, like, I actually was talking to a divorce counselor on a plane once, and he was like, yeah, this reminds me of, like, every couple who comes into my office, and I'm like, yeah, you're doomed. And, like, you know, there's a kind of question that was the best thing anyone said to me when I was getting married was, like, a lot of times you have to ask yourself, do you want to be married or do you want to be right? And, like, no one in America is capable of asking themselves that question right now. It's just win, win, win all the way home.
Yeah, I don't think conservatism needs libertarianism. I mean, I thought I would be
fine. You know, there are
they
other
tried.
They tried for an hour.
Take us out. I think it's precisely because that our nation has. I mean, you gave the example from we have the Bill of Rights. I mean, our traditions of liberty are very deep and very strong. And so I think a conservative piety towards those best traditions are sufficient to guard against, which I agree with Megan. There are things that we need to guard against, various forms of authoritarian suppression of individuality that I think we do need to guard against. But my sense is we don't need the apparatus of libertarian theory to do that. I think we can do that. People may call themselves libertarian if that's the part of our tradition that they're the most passionate about, but I think it's those traditions that are what we need to focus on and not libertarian theory.
Cameron, I promise this man in the front here. Or we're done. Okay, we're done. I'm sorry. Thank you to our panelists.
No, we don't.